Hey there! So you've made a near perfect game, and now you want to follow it up with another entry into the same series. So what do? Do you deviate and try to make something new? Or do you stick with what worked so well the last time? Well, when the time came to follow up Castlevania Aria of Sorrow, Konami decided to go with the latter approach. That's right, this is just another video about Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. So with this being a direct sequel to Aria of Sorrow, it goes without saying that there will be some comparisons here and there. So if you haven't already seen my Aria of Sorrow video, feel free to go give that a watch first or after this. Dawn of Sorrow's development was announced at the beginning of 2005 and was to be the first Castlevania game released on the Nintendo DS. This was during the height of Koji Igarashi's time with Konami, so it only made sense to have him spearhead and produce this entry as well. Aria of Sorrow had quite a bit of success on the Game Boy Advance, so when it came time to choose between the Nintendo DS or Sony's competing PSP handheld as the new home of the sequel, Igarashi ultimately went with Nintendo. The same team who designed Aria of Sorrow were brought back to design Dawn of Sorrow. Unfortunately, this did not include Ayama Kojima, the character designer. This led to the character designs adopting a more anime aesthetic instead of her unique gothic look. And let me just get this out of the way right now. I have never been a fan of the character artwork for Dawn of Sorrow. It's all really bland and uninspired, and really takes away from the overall feel and aesthetic that previous Castlevania entries had. I know I am far from the first person to complain about this, but I mean, just look at these character portraits. Soma's hair in particular just makes him look like he's a big fan of the monkeys. And Julius? Oh God, Julius, what did they do to you? Anyway, while the character artwork may be disappointing, the sprite work was utterly fantastic. The DS was a handheld that was strong enough to handle the amazing sprite work used in Symphony of the Night back on the PlayStation, so it only made sense to port a lot of those sprites over and base the new ones on that same style. And let me just say, it looks really good. As for the music, now series regular Mishiru Yamane, who had composed the music for Castlevania Bloodlines, Aria of Sorrow, and Symphony of the Night, was brought back yet again. She worked alongside Masahiko Kimura, who had developed the music for Castlevania on the N64. With the DS being a much more powerful handheld than the Game Boy Advance, it didn't have nearly the same limitations, allowing the music to sound full and vibrant. Released in August 2005 in Japan and October 2005 in the US, Dawn of Sorrow received critical acclaim from numerous publications. To this day, it's often cited as not only one of the best games to be released on the DS, but also one of the best games ever made. Now, as per usual with these cups of Java, I do like to talk a little bit about the development of the game, as well as its general reception, before I get into my own thoughts and feelings on it. Now, with it releasing in 2005, that was a bit of a golden age in gaming, and there were a lot of powerhouse games that released around that time, and Dawn was no exception. It was one of the earlier DS games that I acquired, and I played it a ton. The fact that it managed to hold my attention when so many other amazing games were being released that same year says a lot. But it's not without its flaws. So let's get into what Dawn of Sorrow actually is. As already mentioned, this is a direct sequel to 2003's Aria of Sorrow, where you once again take the role of Soma Cruz, 1 year after the incident at the titular Castlevania. While out for a walk with your childhood friend Mina, you're suddenly ambushed by a woman named Celia, who summons a handful of various monsters to attack you. Upon defeating them, Soma again absorbs their souls, remarking that his power of dominance, or the power to absorb the souls of his enemies, has returned. Arikado arrives, bringing Soma up to speed on this new cult led by Celia, who wish for the return of the Dark Lord. Telling Soma to stay put while he handles this, Soma does anything but and instead tracks the cult to their hideout with the help of Hammer. And thus, our adventure back into the world of Castlevania actually begins. This being another entry into the Igavania style of Castlevania games means that it once again takes place across a sprawling map that houses numerous enemies, items, and abilities. As you explore, you'll gain new abilities that essentially act as keys, allowing you to access different parts of the castle as you track and attempt to stop the cult from reviving the Dark Lord. Much like Aria, Soma has a wide variety of weapons at his disposal, such as knives, swords, hammers, fists, spears, and of course, guns. While the weapons are still rather similar to their Aria counterparts, there are definitely some changes. First, let me just say that all weapon types are viable in Dawn of Sorrow. Ultimately, it's up to your own personal preference on what you wish to use, and I think that's pretty great. The game does a fantastic job of giving a decent assortment of different weapon types right at the start of the game to allow for experimentation. Don't be fooled by the stat differences in starting weapons, because while hammers, greatswords, and spears may have a much larger increase in attack than say a katana or a fist, they attack much slower this go around. No longer will you be able to chain together multiple greatsword attacks like you could in Aria. No, in Dawn, when you swing a greatsword or a hammer, you are committed to that swing. Sure, it'll do decent damage, but overall, the swing speed can be ridiculously slow. Meanwhile, katanas have a much smaller attack stat, but you can perform cool quick combos by chaining together jump attacks, normal attacks, and dash attacks, and a playstyle that just feels good once you learn the execution. Secondly, weapons all have their own special attacks, which can be used by pressing the A button and take MP. These attacks can cancel out your normal attacks, even the large swings of the two-handed weapons, and offer a bit of attack variety should you wish to use them. While you are given quite a variety of different weapons at the beginning of the game, unfortunately from there, simply finding weapons becomes kind of scarce, and that's due in part to the new weapon synthesis system. Yoko Belnades makes a return from Aria, now serving as a helpful NPC that allows you to take the extra souls from enemies and craft them into weapons. And while this sounds really cool on paper, in practice, it's kind of a mixed bag. I'll get to why in just a bit, because it ties so closely together with the main returning mechanic from Aria, the tactical soul system. Soma, being the reincarnation of Dracula, has the ability to dominate souls. Practically every single enemy in the game has a soul that can be obtained and used in some fashion, and they are broken into 4 different categories, being bullet souls, guardian souls, enchant souls, and ability souls. You can have one type of bullet, guardian, and enchant soul equipped at a time, whereas ability souls take the role of the relics of previous Castlevania titles, giving Soma new forms of movement such as the double jump or super jump, or the ability to shatter ice with the touchscreen, etc. Bullet souls take the place of your classic Castlevania sub-weapons. They're activated by holding up on the D-pad and pressing the attack button, which will use some of your mana. Mana is refilled via save points, items, and of course the classic Castlevania hearts found in candles. There are 46 bullet souls this time around, so 9 less than Aria, surprisingly. Guardian souls are tied to the R button and are typically rather varied in use. Some can be used for movement, such as Bat Company and Black Panther, while others might summon a familiar to attack alongside you, or allow you to perform other more unique forms of attacking. This time, there are 36 Guardian Souls, which is 12 more than what Aria had. Enchant Souls are typically reserved for stat increases or offering various other resistances. They require no mana and are always active as long as they are equipped. This go around, there are 27 of them, which, while that is 7 lower than what Aria had, they took a slightly better approach this time around and didn't waste slots with duplicate souls, and in fact, made the entire system a little bit better for all souls. What do I mean by that? Well, in Aria, there are various enemies that have souls that raise your stats. Some might raise it by 4, while others might raise it by 8 or 16. But the problem with that was sometimes you would find those souls that raised your stats by 8 or 16 before ever finding the soul that raised it by 4, meaning it was completely useless to you. Dawn remedies this by allowing your souls to stack and level up. So now there's only 1 soul per stat type. But if you get multiples of that soul, it just becomes more and more effective. So for instance, a single golem soul will raise your strength by 2. But if you can get 9 golem souls, now your strength will be raised by 18. The cool thing is, this actually applies to a ton of souls in the game, bullet and guardian souls included. Meaning, if you end up with multiple axe armor souls, your thrown axes will just do more damage than if you only had 1. Depending on the ability, it'll take a different amount of souls to level. So for instance, each student witch soul you obtain will increase the level of that bullet soul up to level 9. Whereas axe armor only goes up to level 3, but still takes 9 souls to max out. Some abilities even get visual changes to them as they level up. It's great and a nice little bonus for those who wish to grind out enemies. So how about the general game progression? Well, being a Metroidvania, that means it can be either linear or open-ended. While there is definitely an intended path that the game is trying to guide you down, it is very easy to divert and kind of just go your own way. for better or for worse. In my case, every single time I replay this game now, I always end up accidentally sequence breaking. You see, the normal intended route has you working your way up towards the top of the castle, getting the time stop ability, then working your way back down into the subterranean hell to get the ability that allows you to sink into water, then finally reaching the silenced ruins to get the Bat Company ability. Meanwhile, I just kind of skipped all that and ended up in the silenced ruins by taking a different approach. So as you can see here, I'm on the wrong side of the entrance that would normally require the time stop ability to get through, purely from playing the game in an unintended way. With any other Metroidvania game, this wouldn't normally be an issue, but with Dawn, it is, because of the magic seals. You see, Dawn came out in a slightly awkward time in the DS's lifespan, where if a game was released on the DS, it practically had to use the touchscreen functionality in some way. Now, I've heard that Nintendo is to blame for that, basically strong-arming developers at the time into forcing them to use this new functionality, but at the same time, that could also just be pure speculation. Regardless though, touchscreen mechanics did show up in a ton of early DS games, and unfortunately, Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow is no exception. There are two main aspects that it was used for. The first being to clear these ice blocks from your path once you acquire a specific soul that allows you to do so. The second is the magic seals. The general consensus on these seems to be that people either hate them or tolerate them. Nobody's really praising their existence, myself included. The way that it works is that first you must find these magic seals throughout the castle. There are 5 of them in total. When you reach a boss door, you will only be able to open that door if you have the correct magic seal. This alone halts a lot of progression and acts as a completely unnecessary key that must be found. If you don't have the magic seal, you cannot fight the boss. So in my case, with my most recent playthrough, I found myself in the silenced ruins, unable to fight the boss because I didn't go to the top of the castle first. Which is pretty lame in its own right, because it takes away one of the funnest aspects of these games, which is the ability to sequence break and explore unintended areas early. Magic seals have a secondary function besides simply opening boss doors though, and that's to be used to actually beat the bosses. Once in a boss room, it'll play like normal, but once the boss HP has been fully depleted, the magic seal will pop up on the touchscreen. Depending on which boss you're fighting, you'll have to draw a specific seal from memory to truly defeat the boss. If you mess this up, either by not drawing it fast enough or simply forgetting what the symbol was, the boss will revive with a portion of its health, forcing you to continue the battle until you deplete its HP yet again. This will go on forever until you draw the symbol correctly. This is often cited as one of the biggest issues that Dawn of Sorrow has, and rightfully so. The whole process just isn't really that intuitive. Something to keep in mind is the Nintendo DS is an early touchscreen. It's not as responsive as our phones are today. This means you basically always have to use the stylus, because if you just try to use your finger, it never seems to get an accurate reading. This means that you either have to fumble to pull the stylus out once you beat the boss, and keep in mind, people like me, I'm left-handed, so it's even worse. Or you pull it out ahead of time and awkwardly hold on to it while you fight the boss, and then draw the symbol. It's just not a great mechanic, and one that, if removed, would just make the game better overall. This isn't even Castlevania. It's Mega Man Star Force 2. So while the map itself can be rather open-ended at times, you're still at the mercy of finding the magic seals before making any sort of real progression. On top of this, there are also areas that, should you stumble into them, can be a real pain to get out of. For instance, this room here, it's a room with invisible walls and floors, which can only be seen through the multiple ghosts that spawn endlessly. Typically when you enter this room, it's expected that you'll have the bat ability to fly, or the ability that allows you to sink in water to escape from the right or the left. I had neither, so my only course of action was to carefully navigate my way up through this invisible maze while double jumping and drop kicking on ghosts in an attempt to renew my double jump to continue my escape up. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it was pretty tedious to say the least. To the game's credit, this is kind of my own fault because I did perform a sequence break to get here, but at the same time, as I mentioned before, it's just really easy to sequence break in this game and not even realize that you might end up in situations where you can potentially get stuck like this. Because you see, occasionally you will come across these very specific walls with a switch on the other side, All it takes is to use the special ability of a weapon like the Cut-All to simply teleport over there, hit the switch, and continue on. It's literally that easy. And I know for a fact I'm not the only person who has done this while casually playing Dawn before. For the most part, it's pretty cool, but it does have the caveat of situations like the one I just described, or the fact that the existence of magic seals streamline you back to how the game was intended to be played. Now, before I jump back to the weapon synthesis topic, I do have to cover a very important aspect of Dawn of Sorrow that has an unfortunate effect on the tactical soul system, the weapon synthesis system, and even the general game progression itself, and that is luck. I don't just mean your typical RNG, but the fact that the luck stat in Dawn of Sorrow is quite literally broken and doesn't work as intended. This means that it can take quite a long time to get the items and souls that you want to drop from enemies. Even if you max out your luck at 99, it only affects the drop rate by mere fractions, which is pretty unfortunate. Combine this with the fact that the soul drop rates in Dawn of Sorrow are, for whatever reason, kind of abysmal, you can actually be in for quite a long grind depending on how you want to play the game. When it comes to the weapon synthesis, very rarely will you ever just go back to Yoko and have the soul you need to make a new weapon. Instead, what ends up happening is that you'll browse the menu and see what souls you need to make the new weapon and then go hunting for it. It's rarely ever a nice surprise that you're just going to be able to suddenly make a fancy new weapon. Also, some of the souls needed to make the weapons require boss souls like Gurgoth, which you can only get once per run. This causes yet another issue if you're trying to acquire the Chaos Ring, an accessory that only appears if you have every single soul in the game in your possession. If you spent those souls making new weapons, you will need to acquire them again, and if they happen to be boss souls, you'll be SOL until you beat the game and start a second run to reacquire the said boss soul. I'm just not really a fan of game design that punishes players for simply using the features in the game as intended, as there's absolutely no way anyone would know any of this unless they did research ahead of time before playing. As I mentioned, the drop rates affect more than just the weapon synthesis or trying to make a fun new build with a tactical soul system, because there are actually mandatory souls that need to be acquired to actually beat the game, and those have a surprisingly low drop rate. So for instance, the Ukobak soul is mandatory. According to the Castlevania speedrunner Jupiter Climb, this soul has a drop rate of 3.13%, but according to the wiki, it's like 1.98%. Either way, it's pretty damn low. I'd even made sure I had the Soul Eater ring, an accessory that increases the drop rate of souls, equipped for my most recent playthrough, and it still took me like 10 minutes. Just 10 straight minutes of running in and out of a single room attacking the same enemy, hoping for a drop rate that is 100% mandatory to beat the game. Now, as I had stated in a previous video, I don't mind grinding in games, but what I don't like is when games arbitrarily waste my time. If I'm gonna grind in a game, let me do it because I want to do it, not for this. Now, admittedly, 10 minutes with the Soul Eater ring equipped is abysmal luck on my end, and it is entirely possible, in fact, it's most likely probable that on your own file you'll have a much quicker time. But that's the thing with RNG, is you could technically have a worse time than me, and in fact, Ukobak is only one of the 3 mandatory souls you need to get, so that time can really balloon out of control. And in fact, in my most recent run, I had bad luck with Ukobak and with the mandatory Killer Clown soul. On the one hand, I get what they were going for here. The idea of having these special walls that can only be broken by using very specific soul powers on them isn't a bad one in theory, but what makes it bad is that it's mandatory to beat the game. They could have had these same walls and had it lead to a cool weapon or armor instead. Make it so that the player is rewarded with something unique for their troubles and time, as opposed to rewarding the player with the rest of the game because they grinded out 3 random enemies souls. So what else? Well, the bosses are really fun and the music is excellent, and with the wide variety of weapons and souls at your disposal, you can really craft a playstyle that suits your own tastes. The story is Okay, I'm gonna go on a dumb little tangent here. I'm warning you ahead of time, but let me just say this. The story is pretty dumb and pointless. Not that anyone is playing Castlevania for its gripping story, but like, where was the cult in the last game? If Dario and Dimitri were both born the same day that Dracula died, just like Graham was, why didn't they show up at the real Castlevania back in Aria of Sorrow? In fact, what even is this castle in this game? We are told that Castlevania is a product of chaos and is the Dark Lord's castle that is always changing, but we defeated chaos in the last game. Chaos is gone, chaos is no more. This location is just explained away as the cult's hideout, but it just happens to be a castle that is basically identical to Castlevania in every way. I know that I'm reading way too far into this, but I can't be the only one who found this to be kind of weird, right? Okay. Tangent over. As for the castle itself, it's not bad. It has some cool areas with some great music, but the map itself can be rather lackluster at times, to the point where I'd say that I think Aria's map was just a bit better. The condemned tower comes to mind as pretty forgettable, and the fact that you're forced to climb it, beat the boss, then forced to climb it again, but this time have to slowly jump across pits to get back up to the top, isn't exactly the most fun thing. Combine this with the fact that it sits on top of the Mine of Judgment, which is just the same thing but now going down. Each area, be it the Garden of Madness or the Subterranean Hell, just feel kinda hollow at times and pretty linear. Even the series staple clock tower just doesn't do much for me this go around. The final boss is also a bit disappointing. In Aria, Graham makes a great villain. He's an excellent foil to Soma. His fight feels like the staple Dracula fight. He could have even been the true final boss of Aria of Sorrow and it would still feel complete. And yet we still got the true final showdown with Chaos itself, which just felt like an actual pinnacle. In Dawn though, Dario and Dimitri are both incredibly forgettable villains, with boss fights that are laughably simple. Neither one has the feel of the staple Dracula fight seen at the end of each one of these games. And if you go for the true ending of the game, well, I don't want to spoil this 2005 DS game's final boss, mainly because I do feel like we're going to get a Castlevania DS trilogy at some point in the near future, and that'll open this game up to a lot of new players. But let me just say that the final boss, it's not bad, but I was just pretty disappointed with it. It's got a pretty cool design, but the fight itself was just kinda lackluster. So, you beat the game, but now what? Well, that entirely depends on how you beat the game, because Dawn of Sorrow actually has 3 different endings, one of which leads to Julius Mode. Yes, that's right. Julius Mode is back, and dare I say, better than ever. It's not perfect, but it's damn close. You see, in Aria of Sorrow, Julius Mode followed a similar formula to the previous secondary character modes in the Castlevania games. I.e., there wasn't really a story and you were just a powerhouse working your way through the castle. This time though, they did things a bit differently. You take the role of Julius, working your way through the castle with his own unique story this time around. Similar to Aria, Julius has access to all his typical sub-weapons, such as the Holy Water, Cross, and Axe, as well as the ability to do the Grand Cross. However, he no longer has access to the Super Jump and the Shadow Dash, which I've now learned is called the Omnia Vanitas, by the way. Instead, Julius gets a third jump accessed by pressing the L button, much like the Super Jump would be performed, but without the distinct height gain. This is done to help streamline the game a bit and prevent too much sequence breaking early on. But there are a couple other changes to this mode that make the whole experience utterly fantastic. For the first time ever in the secondary mode, you can actually gain experience points by fighting normal enemies. In previous games, while you could level up, your levels were hidden and they were only gained after beating bosses. Now you have a clear number showing what level you are, and experience points are earned by defeating enemies just like Soma. Secondly is the fact that Julius is not alone this time around, and is joined by Yoko Belnades and Alucard, both of whom are fully playable with their own unique abilities and techniques. As you explore the castle, you'll eventually come across these two and be able to freely change your playable character among them however many times you wish. The levels are shared among the characters. While Julius uses his signature Vampire Hunter Whip and various sub-weapons, Yoko relies on powerful spells much like her ancestor from Castlevania 3. Her normal attacks don't have much range, but they restore HP and MP upon hit, which can be a lifesaver at times. As for Alucard, he plays similar to how he played in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and honestly, it's just cool to see him back again. He uses the Alucard sword and can cast Hellfire and turn into a bat. These three characters are so fun to play with. The entire mode is clearly a throwback to Castlevania 3, even changing the Lost Village music to Beginning, aka the song from the first stage of Castlevania 3. The Dark Chapel also has its music changed to be Simon's Quest's Bloody Tears. I'm not even exaggerating when I say this mode could have easily been a game in of itself. It is absolutely excellent and totally worth playing. The only thing I'd have loved to have seen from it would be a playable version of Hammer to take the Grant role. But much like the Netflix show, it seems that Grant is often forgotten, unfortunately. On the plus side though, magic seals do not exist in Julius Mode, meaning you can straight up beat a boss and that's it. It's done and you can continue on with the game. You can also fight them in whatever order you want as well. If I had to sum up Dawn, I'd say it's a bit of a mixed bag. Now for you Super Dawn fans, don't take that the wrong way. I genuinely love this game, I do. I just don't think it's as good as Aria of Sorrow. That's often the debate you'll see amongst Castlevania fans. Do you prefer Aria or do you prefer Dawn? Both games have their ups and their downs, but I do think that Dawn has some choices that just kind of hold it back. I kept finding myself praising Dawn only to follow it up with a but or an asterisk of some sort. The improvements to the tactical soul system are great, but the soul drop rates are abysmal. Weapon synthesis is pretty neat, but it takes away from simply finding weapons and it's still tied to those same abysmal soul drop rates. The map is pretty open-ended, but the inclusion of the magic seals locking doors prevents you from fighting certain bosses out of order. The boss fights are pretty fun, but you have to draw a magic seal to defeat them, and if you mess it up, you have to fight them again, and it just takes a lot of the enjoyment out of it. You see, there's a lot of buts with Dawn of Sorrow. It is still an absolutely excellent game though, and totally worth playing, especially if you're a Metroidvania fan. I really am hoping that similar to the Advanced Collection, we get a Castlevania DS Collection, which if they do that, they need to include Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth, because it is WiiWare that is currently locked away in the Nintendo Vault. That being said, it is kind of a pain to track down DS games nowadays, but luckily this one isn't too expensive. Last I checked, as of recording this video anyway, it was only going for about 35 bucks. So if you do want to pick up a copy, you can do so relatively cheaply secondhand. And for you internet sleuths out there, there are other methods that might include a patch that fixes the luck glitch, and even a patch that might remove magic seals from the game entirely. Regardless of how you acquire it though, I do highly recommend that you play Dawn of Sorrow. I know I was a little harsher on this one than the other Castlevania games I talked about, but I think that's because this was a direct sequel. So typically with something like that, you're expecting them to only take steps forward. Whereas in this case, they did take a lot of steps forward, but then they took 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But I digress. Anyway, for those of you who have played both Aria and Dawn, which game do you prefer and why? Let me know in the comments. We've got 2 more Castlevania games to get to on the DS, and trust me when I say they are awesome. That being said, my name is AJ, and this was just another video about Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow.